the last 30 years, the investment in higher education on the part of nations normally considered or considered at the time to be developing nations, that investment level has been extremely high. Nations that were peers of Kenya or Ghana or Nigeria a generation or two ago, some of those nations have leaped far ahead to advanced industrial and post-industrial status. I had the opportunity in my role as a faculty member at MIT to watch how the Koreans did it. They decided back in the 1970s that they would become an advanced industrial country. At the time, we all had Motorola products, and we were driving Ford or Chevrolets, or VWs maybe. They decided that they would become an industrial power, and they imported a great deal of expertise to set up the infrastructure for that transformation. They also went about investing in education. They sent plane loads of their young people to Europe and North America to get education. They hired experts from around the world to put the infrastructure in place according to their plan. Their young people graduated from universities in Europe and North America and came back. They came back with Motorola phones in their pockets, and before too long, there was no more Motorola, and we all had Samsungs. Chevrolet was on the skids, and Hyundai became one of the most popular American cars in 2015. How did they do it? They did it by intention, by excellence, by consistency, and by persistence. That's how they made the transformation. And that kind of transformation was made in lots of other places. If we were to imagine where Singapore was at the same time, Singapore didn't exist. It was a really shabby island somewhere out in the Indian Ocean. But they decided, Lee Kuan Yew, their prime minister, decided that they had nothing, so they didn't have much to lose except to invest in their hopes and in their dreams. And we all know Singapore is now one of the leading trading nations in the world. In fact, they trade so much, America has to borrow from them to cover our deficits. My personal experience extended beyond teaching. In teaching, one of the first things I said to students was that you should make no small plans. Nobody gets excited about a small plan. No one will give you much money for a small plan. Nobody will invest their career in your small or modest endeavor. You must think big because that is what draws excitement. And we know that when you think big and when you plan accordingly, the money appears, as it has appeared to you hypothetically this afternoon. Your $250 million, don't forget it. So I want to talk to you about how this might be done in Africa. And I'm going to speak from a regional approach. I think with 55 countries, it's hard to imagine that you can suddenly come up with 55 great plans. But if you can, more power to you. I want to make a case for the creation of an advanced research institute in agriculture and natural resources. Now, I picked that out of any number of options available. I could equally make the argument for engineering or for health, but I'm going to do agriculture. And let me explain why agriculture. First of all, it is the major area of promise on the continent. Yes, there's oil and gas, but that's in the ground and that's probably locked up in contracts that extend well beyond your lifetime. Agriculture is an area that is open to great global research. There are lots of scientific problems embedded in agriculture. The kinds of seeds that will produce plants that work in arid areas. The elimination of insects that challenge crops. The production of feed grain for livestock that is high in protein. And of course, the issue of food for people. There's the issue of how you make agriculture more productive. So the farmer who now may produce X per hectare can, in fact, with a bit of science and technical assistance, produce 10X on the same piece of land. Another reason for including agriculture is that there's some corollary major areas of research. All the world will be affected by climate change. There are aspects of climate change which are unique to different parts of Africa as well as different parts of the rest of the world. There are partners around the world who are anxious to explore climate change, to experiment, to model, and to plan for how to adapt. And it advances not just agriculture, but those collateral areas such as fishing and forestry. Another reason for including it is that agriculture is something over which you have a great deal of control and a deep, deep supply of unused resources measured in millions of acres of land. And it is something that many Africans, in fact, most Africans, already have some connection to. They don't have to be convinced that it's important. It's also an area where there is plenty of industrial collaboration. And industry, I can tell you, would be happy to collaborate on this. If one country, we'll call it country X, were to say that we are going to give a license for 4 types of tractors, and only those 4 types of tractors can be sold in our country. And the cost of a license is a contribution to agricultural education. I promise you, the money will come. Because who would want to be left out of the opportunity to establish their company, their tractor, in an area that has 17% of the world's population and the vast majority of undeveloped farmland? The money will come. And just to make sure you understand how it happens, when laptop computers were first marketed, 2 truckloads of computers rolled up to MIT. IBM was on one truck, and Apple was on the other truck. And they said, faculty, come take whichever one you want. It's free. Now, why did they do that? Well, it was plain advertising. They knew if the faculty member took an Apple, that the students would get assignment on Apple computers. The faculty member would go home and buy an Apple for their own children. The students, when they graduate, will go out and buy an Apple because that's what they've been using for 4 years. And then they would spread the gospel of Apple all around. So that's how it works. You want to emphasize agriculture. Those people who are in the agricultural business in a variety of ways, from seeds and fertilizer to tractors and computers, will rush to figure out how they can be a part of your transformation. But you have to have a plan because, as you know, there are people who have a scheme for you. And you don't want to be victims of a scheme. You want to be takers of opportunity. Finally, well, not finally, another benefit is workforce development. There are lots of young people who sit in the countryside longing for the day when they can find a bus or a train that will take them to the city, where there are no jobs for them. But if you figure out ways of making the countryside more a land of opportunity, many of these young people will stay in the countryside and small towns. That will take the pressure off of big cities that continue to grow without opportunity. Finally, agriculture represents a totally untapped arena for entrepreneurship. There are lots of opportunities that can occur with agriculture, and some of them will be permanent and some of them will be temporary, but all of them will be real. I recall when I was young, before there were refrigerators and freezers, my uncle had a truck, and he would go to the fish market and get a load of fish and drive out into the countryside and sell the fish. Now, he made a very good living doing that because the people in the country didn't have a refrigerator, they didn't have supermarkets, they didn't have access to fish. Now, he ran that business for a while and then it collapsed. It collapsed first because the Piggly Wiggly opened and sold frozen fish sticks. And second, people were able to buy freezers. So they could go to the market themselves and buy a big arm, a big tub of fish, bring it home, put it in the freezer, and have fish whenever they liked. Now, he made a good living in entrepreneurship for a while until technology disrupted his business. But he went on to find other businesses, and that's the opportunity that agriculture offers. There will be opportunities for software, for transportation, for processing, for commodity conversion, for trade, and for manufacture. All of those things without going to some other place in the world to get the fundamental products. I still look for the day when I can get fine candy from Ghanaian farms in Kenya, as opposed to Bloomingdale's. Now, what is this idea about an institution? First, I propose that it be graduate only. And the reason is that there are a number of very strong and improving rural and agriculture education programs in Africa. Rural Farm is one opportunity for undergraduate education and for research. But one of the lessons you learn is that as you do more research is required. And it is much more efficient to create centers of excellence to embrace these institutions rather than to try to make all of them top shelf. Now, that is a 50-year plan. The 100-year plan is that all of those institutions can be research intensive. But why is it important to have top shelf? And let me tell you the reasons why. The first is that infrastructure for research is very expensive. I'm on a board that decided last month to buy a $5 million machine. Now, it wasn't a big deal about buying the machine. If you make a case for why you need a $5 million machine, somebody will come up with the money. But there had been resistance up to this point because this institution did not need 100% of the capacity of this $5 million machine. And it cost $500,000 a year to operate the machine, to maintain it, and to staff it. This is separate from the researchers who use it, but somebody has to make sure the machine works, and when things go wrong, that the German manufacturer is available instantly to repair or replace the machine. So 45 universities can't go out and buy a $5 million machine, but one university can have a set of infrastructure to make it possible for any faculty member in this arena to use the machine. The institute I proposed would have a tiny permanent faculty. And when I say tiny, we could pick a number, 30, 40. But the major human resource used in this institute will be faculty members from other universities in Africa who come to do research in this premium laboratory environment. It would also be the place where researchers from outside of Africa would come, where partnerships would be generated, and most important, where two human resource developments will take place. First is the preparation of new young people new young scientists who are the graduate students and the postdocs who get their training in a first-class, research-intensive environment. The second would be the faculty members at the existing universities who come and spend a year or two at this institution. They do research, and they also do curriculum development so that they go back to their institutions with a stronger sense of what's state-of-the-art in education in their field. Now, there are a number of other things that such institutions should have that need not be created from scratch. And I'm delighted that when Avi described the programs of the MasterCard Foundation, that some of my begging and pleading was reflected in that list of activities. For example, that $5 million machine, when it's purchased next month, will be maintained by a German crew. There is no one in Africa prepared to take responsibility for that machine. But it would be unfortunate if 5 years from now the same were true. So one part of this institute would be a partnership with a technical institution whose curriculum would be synchronized with the requirements of the advanced research. It's sort of like if you're training doctors, you should also train nurses, and you should train lab assistants, and you should train outreach workers, and you should train those who would do other things to make the doctor's work either better or unnecessary. So that's the institution. But there's another thing. Let's go back to the 2 truckloads of computers. Companies, I gather, and I've been poking around a bit on that. One of the questions I've been asking over the last 5 years is what companies are active in Africa, and there's a list of about 75 global companies that have had a long connection to Africa, and there's an even longer list of companies that are newly poking around, as well as African companies who are growing and developing. There's some companies that are sort of stuck in the mud. They've been making bolts and screws for 50 years, and that's all they'll ever do. But most companies that will go far and fast are looking for new ways to improve their processes, new ideas that could be turned into products. They're looking for smart people to help them answer questions that they cannot answer. And they're looking for partners to elevate their own research activity, their own R&D activity. Now, these companies pay major universities in Europe and North America lots of money to sit down to ask those questions. The universities don't promise them anything, only that they will engage and share information. And the companies eat it up. Now, how can this be turned into an opportunity in agriculture and natural resources in Africa? My guess is that companies who are looking to grow and expand and to become partners with African institutions would embrace the possibility of the institute that I'm proposing. Why wouldn't they? They can't come to MIT to learn anything about seeds or fertilizer. We don't know anything about that. But if there's capacity here to answer those questions, they will come here. And then maybe my colleagues at MIT could sort of come in with some biological engineering to add a bit of spice to the enterprise. Now, I haven't used the word government in this presentation, and that's intentional. African governments have a role to play because I would not take seriously any proposal to create this institute if it were not embraced by at least one president and presidents from the region. Not because we need their money, In fact, their money should not be used for this. It should be used for elementary and secondary education and undergraduate education. But there are enabling institutions or enabling rules and regulations that these governments are responsible for and that they should commit to before the first dollar is spent. There are well-meaning regulations and there are poorly drawn regulations. For example, if a country said that you need 10 acres of land before you could start an institution, I could take them to several institutions on 2 acres of land that are doing just fine. I would hope their regulatory regime would be focused on outcomes and not prescriptions, because no government is smart enough to be able to prescribe with exactness what is appropriate, including what is taught in the class, how much land is required, or many other things that some governments are trying to do, well-intentioned, but not always well-grounded. Now, I want to close by indicating that what I've suggested is not something that's far away from either the experience of other countries or Africa. For example, a dozen years ago, a Ghanaian employee at Microsoft decided to create a university in his hometown, or in his home country. Patrick Oweah came to Ghana and created Ashesi University. First rate, day one, okay? I don't know how he came up with what probably was north of $50 million to start it, but I can assure you that people I know who have money have been very excited about the experiment. And I know Patrick was able to convey both his intention, his qualifications, and all of the things that made his case compelling. Another program I visited in South Africa is the African Leadership Academy. Fred Swanica came back to South Africa and decided that there were lots of young people in Africa who had a secondary education that made them not quite ready for prime time. They were bright, they were committed, but they just needed an extra lift. And he created the academy, and the admissions officers from the best universities in the world lined up to take the students. Another example, you remember I mentioned Singapore. They decided to create something like what I'm describing, but rather than focusing just on agriculture, they focus on a number of high-tech and life science areas. They created the Smart Center in Singapore, which basically is a place where the people in the world that they regard as the best team for whatever it is they decide to study in a given period would be invited to Singapore, first to work there and then to partner with their home institutions. We had a meeting in Cambridge, sponsored by the Carnegie Foundation about a month ago, that addressed the question, what is the role of the diaspora in the transformation of the continent? And I'd already done my informal survey. I was of the belief, for example, that there are more Ghanaian-born doctors in New York than there are in Accra. I haven't made that count, so I'm not going to claim, but it'll be close. So what I suggested in thinking for that meeting was, there's the concern that the diaspora has been leaving Africa for many years. Is there a chance to get them back? And the answer is yes. From my informal survey, I have never gotten a flat no when I asked the question of a middle-aged or older member of the diaspora, because if you ask someone who's young, and they'll think about education and all the sorts of things that young families think about. But if they're 50 or more, and I ask them, would you go back to, I'll fill in the blank once I know where they're from, would you go back and do your thing, whether it's medicine or business or engineering, in a home country? And the answer usually starts with 10 questions. The bottom line is they would be happy to do it if they believed that they were going back to a setting in which they would be able to do their best work and that they would be valued and respected for it. No one ever mentioned salary. I pick these older guys because they have a pension. No one ever said, no, I wouldn't consider that. They would say, well, it depends on the housing, it depends on whether my wife would go, it depends on whether you could show me a doctor who's good at shoulders or hips, and so forth and so on. So the diaspora is a real experience. There are people out there who have done all of the things we've talked about. They have taught the subjects in graduate schools, they've been deans, they have been department heads, and they have reached age 55, 57, 62, and they're waiting for a call. And it won't be an easy call, but I think if you put something in place that represents a credible proposition, they will come back. Indeed, I want to close by suggesting that what I've tried to describe is an investable proposition. I don't think too many people, once they see a plan, would say no. They might say, well, I don't give money for that. You might try these foundations down the street. And there are companies that will say, well, yeah, I give University X $100,000 a year to sit and listen to what they have to say. And let's see how much would I give you. And then that you start your negotiation. But I think there is an opportunity to move forward to achieve the transformation, which is the only way I see things happening. Those nations that started on a path of transformation 30 years ago are moving more swiftly. And the swift dimension that relates best to you is the one about collaboration. If you're sitting in New York and you're interested in food security, there is no food security long agenda in New York City. There are some issues. There are food deserts in New York City. But the opportunity to explore issues like climate change, agricultural productivity, enhanced productivity in livestock, the preservation of fragile ecosystems that would be the basis for tourism and recreation, as well as an endless supply of resources for Africans. Fisheries, you know, I asked the guy at the fish market the other day where the shrimp came from that I was buying, and he told me Vietnam. Well, you know, the west coast of Africa is a lot closer to Boston than Vietnam. And your waters are just as accommodating to agriculture as the waters off of Vietnam. So I want to end by saying that there are opportunities. I could have made the same argument about health, about engineering, or about other fields. But I did agriculture because I think it is the lowest hanging fruit for the transformation of not just higher education, but opportunity on the continent. Thank you very much.